Hello, I'm Kok-Sing Tang from Curtin University School of Education. Welcome to this conversation series with the researchers at the School of Education. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor John Williams here to talk about his research on technology education. Before we begin, I'd like to give a brief introduction of Professor John Williams and his research. John is a professor of education and also the director of graduate research in the School of Education at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. He teaches and supervises research students in STEM and technology education. Apart from Australia, he has worked and studied in New Zealand and the United States and a number of African and Indian Ocean countries. His current research interests include STEM, mentoring beginning teachers, pedagogical content knowledge or PCK, and electronic assessment of performance. He regularly presents at international and national conferences, consults on technology education in a number of countries, and is a long-standing member of 8 professional associations. He is elected to the International Technology and Engineering Education Association's Academy of Fellows, which, as I understand, is a very influential body in the profession. So thank you very much for taking this time to join us in this conversation, John.
Good. It's good to be here. Thanks, Kok-Sing.
Right. So you have a very impressive resume and quite a diverse background. So I'd like to start by asking you, what was your journey like that got you to the place you are today?
So I was born in the southern coast of Victoria, along the surf coast, and that's where I did all my schooling in that area. So it was a mix of surfing and schooling. So I wasn't a great student, but that's where I did all my high school. Then I went to New South Wales to do my teacher training. After that, I taught in Adelaide for a couple of years. But there was a delay there. When I finished my training, I really didn't feel like facing a classroom. I wasn't a confident teacher because I'd come straight from year 12 into teacher training, I wasn't ready to teach. So I did a few other things for a few years, but eventually decided I should be a teacher. So taught in Adelaide for a couple of years. I'd always wanted to do more study, even though I wasn't a great student. I enjoyed studying. So the degree I wanted to do wasn't available in Australia at the time. So I went to the US and did my master's and kind of surprised myself by doing okay. And so I stayed there to do my PhD. After that, we have lived in Newcastle, in Zimbabwe, and in New Zealand for 5 or 6 years in each of those places, and then about 15 years now in Perth.
Wow, what a wonderful journey you have.
Good journey.
So your area is really into technology education. So can you tell us more about how do you get into this area and what does this area on technology education encompass?
It wasn't actually my first choice to be a technology teacher. I thought I'd like to be an architect initially, but in my schooling, sort of surfing got in the way, so I didn't have the high school scores necessary to get into architecture. I'd always enjoyed making stuff. My dad was a mechanic and a tinkerer, so he was always working on projects, so I grew up with that and always enjoyed making things. So thought, a good career might be making stuff and teaching other people how to make stuff. So I trained as what was called then a manual arts teacher, and it really was all about making stuff. That curriculum area has evolved now into what we call technology education. So it still has quite a significant practical focus, but there's also an attention to cognitive development as well. So it's not just developing practical skills, but also focusing on students' innovation and creativity, And that's really the focus of technology education now, with the goal of developing students' technological literacy. So it's a practical subject. Students think about things and then develop those ideas in a practical, real way, and at the same time develop their technological literacy.
Right. So this tinkling things about making things is quite a hot topic right now within STEM education. So you're in the right place.
Well, it's kind of there's a resurgence of that with STEM and with maker spaces. Yeah. Really, technology education is the original maker space. So in a lot of schools, the technology workshops are sort of the maker spaces. So there is a new currency with that these days.
Right. And you mentioned your research. So what has been your main approach to research throughout your career?
I got my PhD fairly early. When I was 30, I got my PhD. And immediately after that, I wasn't in a research-intensive context. So even while doing my PhD, I didn't publish. Bad supervisory advice, I think, but nevertheless, that's the way it was then. And then soon after I got my doctorate, I lived in Africa for the next 5 or 6 years, and there was not a significant research culture there. So it took me a while before I kind of got into the mode of doing research. But what's worked well for me over the years is having sort of some elements of research on the go all the time. So there's 3 areas that I've focused on. One is small research projects into my own practice. So elements of teaching or elements of pedagogy or curriculum or something that I'm doing that I want to research, and that usually results in a publication or a conference presentation. Secondly, are small grant-supported research in the institutions that I've been at. That's been a possibility. So I've focused on that, where you work with 1 or 2 other people and also generate some collaborative outcomes. And then at the same time, focusing on big research grants, because they're the ones that really potentially make a difference, have an impact. And so I've found that having those 3 approaches to research on the go all the time, so having a small project going at the same time you're applying for a large grant, has served me quite well.
And I'm sure that's good advice for many other researchers out there.
Maybe.
Could you tell us what is the global picture of research in technology education at this moment?
I enjoy being in the technology education research community because it's not a big community and you can almost know all the areas in the world which are doing significant research in technology education. So that sense of community is something that I've enjoyed in this area. It's not a strongly researched area, however, I think for a number of reasons. And one is its practical origins. So many of the teachers who are in technology education and the academics are there because they enjoy practical stuff, where you just get on and do things, which is kind of contrary to a research approach in a sense. So I think that's been an impediment to broad-based research in technology education. And also I think the relative newness of technology as a curriculum area. I mean, in Australia it's only been 40 years or so, which in a sense is a long time, but compared with other subjects, it's not long at all. So I think the newness of it has not enhanced the research. But If I think around the world, there's particular areas which are conducting good research. England has always been a source of research in technology for a long time. That's taken a real hit recently with the move to school-based teacher education. So that's meant the demise of a lot of academics, and so they don't research in that area anymore. Scandinavian countries do a lot of research in technology. It has strong government support. There's a lot of research in China that's taking place. A lot of it's not published in English, unfortunately, so we can't learn about that, but it's very active. New Zealand has always been a focus for technology education research. So there's certain areas around the world where technology is a significant focus of research.
So you mentioned that everybody knows each other's significant research projects. So what would you classify as your most significant research project?
I think it would be the ARC projects that I've led. I've led a couple of projects in Australia and New Zealand. And because of the scope of those projects, I think of the different levels of research that we engage in, I think they most commonly or are most inclined to have significant impact. So one project I did in Western Australia, which was a linkage project, and linkage projects I think are particularly susceptible to impact because you have a linkage partner who's vested in the research. And so the outcomes are more likely to be used in that context, I think. And what we did in Western Australia was research into the digital capture of student performance. Mm-hmm. So we looked at a range of subjects where performance was an important element of the subject. So language, for example, where students had to speak. Physical education, where students had to do things. Engineering, where students have to make things. Information technology, where students have to produce artifacts. So in these subjects, performance is really important. And it's very difficult or almost impossible to capture that within a written exam. So there was an obvious gap here in terms of this research. So it was a 3-year research project. It had a lot of outcomes in terms of publications and books, and it was the mechanism where we formed a lot of international links. Similar research was taking place in England and in other countries subsequently. And it had an impact because departments began looking at different ways of assessing performance through using digital mechanisms. We also combined that digital approach with a comparative pairs assessment approach. So of the digital products, we subjected that not to normal assessment, which is rubric-based often, but comparative pairs assessment. And that resulted in remarkable reliability measures for the raters, the examiners. So that had an impact as well. There's an increasing number of systems around the world that are now looking at comparative pairs assessment.
Well, just for our audience, ARC is an Australian Research Council grant. It is the country's most prestigious and most competitive grant. Many people consider it is the Oscar Award for researchers here. So congratulations for having the ARC grant. Right, besides this ARC grant, what other research have you conducted?
All my research has been contained within the area of technology education. But nevertheless, that's still quite broad. And When I was a mid-career researcher, I thought, on reflecting on my own research, I thought I'm kind of a little bit all over the place. It's all within technology, but I'm researching assessment, I'm researching pedagogy, I'm researching digital tools. And I looked around at other academics who had a real focus and thereby developed an international reputation for that focus. So in a sense, at that stage, I wished that early in my career I had more focused on a particular area. But now in retrospect, I think it's okay. It's sort of, as I said, contained within technology, even though my research has been in a lot of different areas. So I suppose I haven't developed a particular reputation for research in a narrow band, but within the broader technology area. So I've looked at research trends within technology. I did a research project from 2006 to 2017 looking at the trends of research within technology education. So research about research, which I think was a useful thing to do. I've looked at PCK within technology and how that relates to the technology area. You and I together have looked at literacy, STEM literacy, and I've also looked at technological literacy. So my research historically has been quite broad, but I think in retrospect that's been okay.
Yes, I agree with you that that's a good thing to have a broad area of research. So I know that you are the editor of this Springer book series of contemporary issues in technology education. So can you tell us more about what is the focus of this series and how does it promote research?
I just happen to have one of these with me. So this is what the series looks like. And I think there's a couple of ways that this series promotes research. There's a traditional problem with research outcomes getting to the people who need them. And in education, this is often researchers talking to teachers. And there's often a dissonance there because there's no incentive for researchers to publish or to have their research outcomes published in forums that are easily accessible to teachers. So one of the aspects of this book series is to invite recent PhD graduates to write a chapter in which they talk about their PhD research, but they focus on what it means for teaching. So we're now in the third book in that series. So we've got about 50 PhD students in technology education who have written chapters focusing on what their research means for teaching. So I think that's filling a nice gap. And the other way the series addresses research needs is that many of the books are demand-driven. So people who are doing research or recognising the need for research in a particular area come with a book proposal. So we've looked at pedagogy in technology, we've looked at the notion of critique in technology, we've looked at assessment, we've looked at design. We're currently developing a book on systems approaches within technology, and also another book on indigenous technologies with an author from South Africa. So it's quite a need-driven series. So I think it's promoting research well in that sense.
I think that's a good idea. I wish you had such a book series for science education where the PhD students can write a chapter about their research.
It's a good thing. It's a good outlet for the PhD students as well.
Yeah.
So soon after they graduate, they have the opportunity to develop a book chapter, which is good for them.
Yep. So you are still a very active researcher. What is your current approach to research now?
I'm an opportunistic researcher now. So I look for opportunities to support other people in doing their research. So I no longer publish as a first author. I no longer initiate many projects. I do some, but not as many as I used to, because I think my contribution can be more supporting younger researchers in developing their research profiles. So I'm working with a couple of recent PhD graduates in Nanjing in China. They're looking at teacher attitudes. In Taiwan, I'm working with a group of researchers there who are looking at STEM and technology teachers using STEM. I'm working with some book editors in Sydney and New Zealand and South Africa to develop books in areas that they're particularly interested in. So I'm finding there's lots of opportunity to support others, and I'm enjoying that approach to research at the moment.
Mm-hmm. So in a nutshell, you have moved from an experienced researcher to a mentor researcher right now.
I think that's maybe where I can contribute at this stage.
Yes. All right, we have come to the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your research and your wisdom with us, John. I really enjoyed talking to you about this research area. And this has been Curtin School of Education Research Conversation with Professor John Williams. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you soon in our next conversation. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, Kok-Sing. Goodbye.